All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Terry Bissonette. I am the program manager for the Indigenous Women's Leadership Network. I am Ganoje Conning Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes region, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, to be exact. I did grow up in Denver, Colorado, and I'm actually currently located in Albuquerque. So the Colorado River Basin has been a part of my lived experience, and super excited. Actually, had the opportunity to visit the headwaters this past over the holidays, and was horrified that there was no snow. I've never been up there during that time when there was no snow, but I'm super excited to have to be joined with today with Ann Castle and also Heather Tanana. And I'm going to go ahead and read their very short bios, and then I'm going to just turn it right over to them. The way that we will have this set up today is Heather will be presenting, and then Anne will present, and then we will have some time for questions and answers, some Q&A at the end. So welcome, everyone. Um, Heather Tanana, a citizen of the Dene Nation, is a law professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Heather's research interests revolve around the intersection of environmental and health policy. Much of her work focuses on tribal water issues, from climate change and the impacts to Colorado River management. She also leads the Universal Access to Clean Water initiative, which seeks to bring awareness to the lack of clean and safe, reliable drinking water in Indian country, and to make tangible progress on securing water access for all tribal communities. So welcome, Heather. Ann Castle is a senior fellow at the Getches Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado Law School, where she focuses on Western water issues, including Colorado River policy and management. Ann is also the former U.S. Commissioner on the Upper Colorado River Commission and Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at the U.S. Department of the Interior. So welcome, Heather and Ann, and I'm going to turn it over to Heather to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Terry, for that introduction. And love being a part and joining IWLN, because I think this is such a great network. I'd say probably the last 5, 6, gosh, time flies, 7 years, maybe even now, I've been focused a lot more on the environment, water. Prior to that, I did some ICWA work and some other kind of more like juvenile court stuff. And I've got to say, since moving in this sphere of water, it is so empowering to be surrounded by women and a lot of Indigenous women who are representing our communities. And so I think it's a wonderful field to be in. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you are like I did a public health degree program, law school, anything like that, resources. I just have really appreciated the connections, and many people I see on here I consider very, very close friends, and partly because of opportunities like this. So for better or worse, you can Google me and find my email address, but it's heather.tanana@du.edu. And again, please never hesitate to build on the connections that you meet through the organizations like IWLN. Anyway, okay, so with that, jump right in because we love, it's a smaller group, so hopefully we can get some good comments, questions going on later. But, Anne and I met through the launch of Universal Access to Clean Water for Tribal Communities, this work that she and Bitta Becker had started at the start of the pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit about what we do at UACW, particularly with respect to domestic drinking water access for tribal communities. But just as a start, I want to just give a little call out of what an important time it is right now that we continue to educate, we continue to bring attention to the water inequities and challenges that our communities are facing and continue to try and push for change. Also going to highlight a couple EPA actions that we should all be aware of that went on, are going on, and have before I turn it over to Anne, who the second half and kind of bulk there will be talking about Colorado River governance, also a very hot topic right now and ongoing. So first off, right, how many, I was at the NIHB conference. I think this was time again blurs for me. I think it was May of last year. And we're walking down the street, and a young teenage gentleman happens to say out loud where we could overhear him. Crystal was with me, I think, on this one. And he goes, I didn't realize that Indians are still here today. And that, unfortunately, is a very common misunderstanding, lack of education in our country, that people think Native Americans, we don't have tribal governments anymore, or just really have a lot of misunderstandings about tribal sovereignty, the federal government to government relationship, and all of these things. And so, just as a preliminary matter in our work, we find that we're having to do a lot of education. There are 575 federally recognized tribes, right? Beyond that, there's state recognized. There's other tribes who are fighting for recognition, and that number is not stagnant, right? Really exciting that we got a kick up from 574 to 575 recently. And so just this awareness of what, again, tribal governance very much being in existence today, their authority to pass their laws governing their land, their resources, their people. And with past federal policies, particularly reservation era, right, we have been restricted onto certain areas of land. So 326 federal Indian reservations across the United States, right? Very importantly, up in Alaska, only one, right? And so these things kind of matter when we start talking about what is Indian country, what are tribal trust lands, and can get kind of technical. But I really encourage you look at our reports, Native American Right Fund, amazing reports with Headwaters. They just released one specifically about water issues for Alaska. These are really good resources out there so that you can be armed to help educate and push your issues that are important to you. So as of June last year, we had 39 tribal water rights settlements. So with the establishment of reservations came the recognition that in order for these lands to be livable, we need sufficient water to meet the purpose of that reservation. Typically, that's going to include a homeland, but it could include other things, right? Like our hunting and fishing tribes. What other reasons a tribe may have had their reservation established, and they're going to need sufficient water to meet those needs. So, of our 30 tribes in the basin who have water rights that they're able to quantify, the tribes that have quantified them represents about 20 to 25% of the annual flow of the river. So just keep that in mind, right? As Anne is going through what that's only what's quantified. There are still outstanding unquantified rights out there, as I'm sure we'll kind of get into later. Even the quantified rights that have been recognized and that tribes are entitled to use are not being fully utilized. So these things are kind of in the background, right? Helping us to understand why is it the case where we have tribes in the basin who have a pretty significant interest in the Colorado River, but nonetheless, we have water haulers. They don't have delivery into their homes, right? How is that inequity still here today, 21st century? And so these are kind of some of the data that we will utilize in our work that, again, kind of challenging because the data we're working with can be more limited, but by some estimates, it's been up to 48%. Tribal homes don't have access to reliable drinking water sources. This can be lack of piped delivery coming in, could be maybe they have faucets they can turn on, but the water's not safe to consume, right? Or our systems are not climate resilient, we're losing water, threatening delivery of systems, all sorts of things. And so this great report, U.S. Water Alliance and Dig Deep highlighted Native Americans 19 times more likely to not have the plumbing access in. We look at our Navajos or Dene, right? We're 67 times. How does that impact public health? Right? Water is necessary for everything, our economic development, healthy, thriving communities. When the Indian Health Service started their sanitation facilities construction program, they saw a huge impact on the public health of tribal communities, big decrease in diarrheal, other kind of illnesses and diseases related to poor sanitation. And so it makes a difference. It's really important. Again, encourage you, arm yourself, get up on these stats because a lot of people don't know them, and it can be a really useful way of helping to connect with other people because most likely they have no idea what's happening out in Indian country. All right. So again, kind of grounding the work that we do and really all about water is that we're promised a permanent livable homeland. Our treaties are contracts. These are enforceable legal obligations of the federal government. And you can't have a homeland without water, basic necessity of life, right? I'd even extend that out nowadays, right, to other things like electricity in your home, right? We're meeting by Zoom right now. Who has reliable internet access to be able to function and promote your growing economies? And then also along with that, I'll also say, and this kind of gets, I think, a little bit more when we're talking about environmental governance and regulation. Tribes are sovereigns, have the ability to pass tribal laws, like I mentioned before. And can tribes really exercise that full political, cultural sovereignty if they don't have the ability to say what happens with their water, to have access or govern it in a way that recognizes the kinship and relational aspect that many of us have with water? And so those are kind of some of the things that, again, really go and ground our work. All right. So, like I said, we view water access very much as a federal obligation and promise. And in recognition of that, I think the federal government has developed many programs to facilitate water access out in tribal communities. And this is one of our first reports, really looked at all of the different programs that are out there with the Indian Health Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, Bureau of Reclamation, right? They all have different reasons why the agency was established, what their mission is. And as part of that, we'll have different programs that's available. And so see in a second, that makes it challenging to then kind of piece together these different pieces to meet a whole community need in a holistic manner. But if you talk to any of our agency folks, who's responsible? Primary mission is it to facilitate water access out for our tribes? They'll all point at Indian Health Service because of that sanitation facilities construction program that is focused on bringing in water delivery into Native American homes. But no big surprise, big challenge in our appropriations out for these programs. And you can see historically the need that IHS had identified to help build programs, expand access, fix existing access, right? Maybe there's a deficiency or it needs some kind of upgrade, maintenance, things like that. They're only receiving a very small fraction of the money that they needed. Now, the bipartisan infrastructure law, IJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, right? You hear it referred to as both ways, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. These bills and laws, as they're enacted, provided a lot of money for these federal programs, including IHS and EPA, and then reclamation under IRA as well. So very much needed water. And we were all cheering when the law got passed that these programs or infrastructure projects would finally get some momentum to be built. They cost a lot of money. They take years to do. Really exciting. But we're seeing a little bit of pullback, right, with our current administration. Some funding is still going out the door, and reclamation under the IRA received $550 million for domestic water supply projects. A large part of that going to or dedicated to disadvantaged. Oh, and you have to the exact term is like disadvantaged communities, something along those lines. And they had represented that a large portion would be dedicated towards tribal communities to fit within that definition. So a lot of projects of those did go out last year, some funding, more funding this year. But we're seeing things like the state revolving funds under EPA, really important source for local tribal governments. The tribal set aside is a percentage of the broader state revolving fund. So in theory, that we should have seen a bump up. Now EPA's position recently has been, well, we don't need to deploy all that funding. because you got all this other money before. So again, we have another report I'll kind of refer to you on this administration's priorities, the president's proposed budget that he set out that I don't think is fulfilling the federal treaty trust responsibilities. And we want to make sure we're uh, continuing to hold our government accountable, continuing to, you know, tell your representative we need to fully fund these programs. So all of that said, nonetheless, even with bill and IRA, right, these are hard programs to navigate. Like I said, each agency has their main priority. EPA will be like, we're focused on water quality, not increasing the net number of access points for Native American homes, right? Each of them kind of do a little bit different things. And so it can be hard to work through, figure out which program's appropriate, what's the application process, do I have to competitively apply for it, or is it like IHS's where you get in the database and then they have a mechanism where the agency will prioritize it and hopefully get around to you, right? Really kind of challenging. Also, GAO report out there about EPA not getting the funding out in a timely manner, right? So even if you are supposed to get money, sometimes it's hard to actually get that out the door from the agency. Some programs have matching requirement or just other limitations. And then I'll say the big thing we are focused on this year is this operation and maintenance of systems, right? Wonderful infrastructure projects that uh, got initial funding to go out. How is the tribe going to operate and maintain those systems into the future to not threaten delivery of water if they have limited resources available? Water is a very costly thing to deliver as compared to kind of electricity, a little bit cheaper, right? All of these things can make it really challenging. So something to be aware of is the Tribal Access to Clean Water Act. This is something that our representative, Senator Bennett, Representative Neguse in Colorado served as the primary sponsors for, and good place to be reaching out to your representative to say, hey, you should support the Tribal Access to Clean Water bill because it will fill some of the gaps left behind by bill and IRA. Things like authorizing technical assistance, um, operation and maintenance support, and again, under reclamation technical assistance as well. USDA, I know if you've heard me talk before, I always call them the small but mighty little agency because they have the most flexible kind of authorities within their programs, but they didn't get money for tribal water infrastructure projects under bill or IRA. So this kind of is recognizing USDA roles. So we'll go ahead and share again on our website. We've got a fact sheet on this. We've got a toolkit that can help you with some of the kind of data points or messaging to share. All right. Okay, so just briefly before I hand the baton over to Anne, I did want to highlight what's happening right now with our Clean Water Act. So this really important federal statute, right? It's meant to regulate, protect our nation's waters, the chemical, physical, biological integrity of it, really targeting, right, like prohibiting pollution or limiting pollution into our water sources, and allows for some local control over this, right? Our states and tribes, if they go through the right process, can receive TAS treatment in a manner similar to states or treatment as states. You hear it kind of called both ways, where they then can set their own water quality standards. And so again, this can be really important mechanism to help prevent polluters, right? Set these water quality standards that industry has to comply with. Now, James Grijalva, if you were to Google him, he has some good reports out there about this gap that's in Indian country with respect to water quality standards. If a tribe has not proposed their own water quality standard, right? And it's no big surprise, not the easiest process to go through. You need to show you've got this capacity for it, right? Managing it may be difficult and not something that every tribe wants to do. And so if they haven't done it, well, what's the minimum standard out there for these communities, Sure, in theory, EPA, right, can fill in the gap, but what Professor Grijalva has written about is that the result has been kind of a lack of protection for many of our tribal communities and their water. And so EPA proposed in 2023 to establish a baseline water quality standard for reservation waters that didn't have existing Clean Water Act standards. Would have been great. Rule got withdrawn, right, at the end of 2024. And so now we have estimates 250 tribal nations that don't have that kind of minimum protection for their communities. Again, I'll try and, while Anne's talking, drop in some of these links, but Professor Grijalva has written about this. I think NARF also was involved in the lawsuit as well. So some background resources there. If this is an area of interest for you, you can learn a little more. So that happened. And then we have our actual waters of the United States, right? You'll hear this WOTUS. What does Clean Water Act apply to? Right? Waters of the United States. So this definition is really important. What constitute waters of the United States? That's going to allow for the regulation of this. After our Sackett versus EPA Supreme Court decision, we saw that the definition was going to be a little more limited. What's continuous, right? And so people were really concerned about the impact of what will be determined to be waters of the United States. Will it adequately protect the water resources and kind of the holistic view and interconnections that hydrology supports, things like that. Well, now we've got EPA released their proposed definition. Comment period has closed, and their proposed definition and ours and many others is much more narrow than what would be required by Sackett. And so again, I'll link in, we submitted comments, the American Rights Fund submitted comments, a few other tribal organizations, and it's basically saying, hey, EPA, your definition uh, doesn't account for the hydrology and these connections that are important, right? Ephemeral streams and things like that. And I think sometimes, I'll be honest, all right, I have a tendency to think like, oh, wetlands areas, that's what this is talking about. That's a Great Lakes problem, or like out in Florida and the Everglades. No, right? We did some actual mapping to show what this rule and how it would impact our Southwest communities. And so it's an important issue that will more broadly affect tribes across the US and not necessarily in one region specifically. So we'll kind of see what happens, how EPA responds to the comments. Wouldn't be surprised, right, if some litigation follows. And then finally, this is another section of the Clean Water Act. It's called Section 401, and it allows states and again tribes, if they've gotten TAS, treatment as state status, to certify projects that the federal government is issuing a permit for that may impact their waters, right? So they can look and say like, hey, no, this project is going to negatively impact our water source. We've got to make these changes before the permit can be issued, kind of things like that. And the narrowing when it comes to tribal communities of this rule is changing considerations from looking at the activity as a whole, what the, if this permit were granted, what's the activity of the whole, the impacts of it, to solely a discharge focus. So it's kind of narrowed the scope of what tribes with TAS or states should be allowed to look at. We also had, with the current rule, before it gets changed, the opportunity for tribes to get TAS status specific to 401's Section 401 or as a neighboring jurisdiction. So in short, the kind of takeaways to be aware of this is that EPA's proposed changes that they have been doing lately are going to leave tribes, local government less empowered to protect their waters and their communities, and should be something, again, sign-on letters, comments are happening, reaching out, educating people about this. to bring attention to it. I know we have a lot happening in this country, but the attack on our environment and natural resources is very real and very ongoing. So that was like a whirlwind, right? So if you have questions, put them in the chat. We can talk a little further later. But the other hot topic, right, that we've seen is Colorado River. Oh my gosh, this water, 40 million people. Deadlines are flying by. What is going to happen? And so excited to pass it over to our expert extraordinaire, Ann Castle. So I'll stop sharing and Ann will put up her slides.
Thanks, Heather. And thanks to IWLN for inviting me to be here today. It's great to see some friends on the picture, and yeah, so Happy New Year to everybody. And I'm going to jump in to Colorado River update. As Heather said, there's a ton going on right now, and some deadlines coming up very quickly. And some of you in this webinar are total experts on the Colorado River, but I want to make sure that we're all on sort of the basic same page. So I'm going to go through some basic concepts and constructs that support the story about where we are today. So I'll do that quickly, but I apologize to those of you for whom this is going to be kind of boring. So starting out with the map, you guys, I'm sure, have all seen this. This is the Colorado River Basin. It shows the upper basin and the lower basin separated. And the separation point for those two basins on the river is at Lee Ferry, which is a little bit downstream of Glen Canyon Dam, the dam that creates Lake Powell. Lower basin states are Arizona, California, and Nevada. And the upper basin states are New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. So everything that we do in the Colorado River Basin in terms of operations and management and governance comes from the 1922 Compact. That's kind of the foundation for what we call the law of the river, all the different agreements and statutes and treaties that govern how we operate the Colorado River. So the Compact from 1922 told us the basic rules. First of all, it told us that the river is divided equally between the upper basin and the lower basin, 7.5 million acre feet to each. And that equal division you hear a lot about, it's often quoted in the press, and that's sort of true, but it has some serious conditions on it. First one being the lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet, but then another million acre feet on top of that. The upper basin gets 7.5 million acre feet, but there's a big condition on the upper basin share. In short, the upper basin has to ensure that they don't cause the flow at Lee Ferry, that pivot point between the two basins, to fall below 75 million acre feet over any 10-year period. And then finally, the compact required that if deliveries to Mexico were required in the future, in 1922, we didn't have a treaty with Mexico, but the framers of the compact anticipated that we might. So if that happened, the delivery requirement would be split equally between the upper basin and the lower basin. And because this is complicated, and there's also a fairly significant disagreement about what this compact really means, I wanted to show you the exact language. So first of all, we have the equal division, a portion to the upper basin and the lower basin, the exclusive use of 7.5 million acre feet of water per annum. So equal division. But then the lower basin's given the right to increase its use by another million acre feet. And then this is the big caveat on the upper basin. Upper basin won't cause the flow of the river at Lee Ferry to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over any 10-year consecutive period. And you can kind of imagine that in a river with volatile supplies, and particularly a river affected by climate change, that having a fixed volume obligation becomes problematic. And we're seeing that today. And then finally, with respect to Mexico, the compact says that about that obligation to Mexico, it'll first be met by any surplus in the river. We haven't had surplus in quite a while. And if there's not a surplus, the states of the upper division shall deliver at Lee Ferry water to supply 1/2 of the deficiency. So that's the equal split of the Mexico obligation. Okay. Just to sort of recap, these are the legal allocations from the Compact and the Mexico Treaty, which we reached in 1944 and provided that the United States would deliver 1.5 million acre-feet to Mexico every year, with some caveats on that. But we have the compact that said 7.5 million each to the upper and lower basins, another million for the lower basin. That adds up to 16. Then we have the treaty with Mexico, another 1.5. So now we're up at 17.5 million acre-feet per year. Then if we add in evaporation from the big reservoirs, that's about another 1.5 million acre-feet. So the legal plus physical allocations of water add up to 19 million acre-feet. A lot of water. We thought we had that much, or the people in 1922 thought they had that much. But I'm going to talk about what we've really got. So just keep that 19 million acre-foot number in mind. So this is a chart that shows the natural flow of the river at Lee Ferry. So again, that dividing point between the upper and lower basins. And natural flow is a calculated number. It is intended to represent the amount of water that would be in the river at Lee Ferry if there was no human intervention whatsoever. So the way they get to that number is there's a stream gauge really close to Lee Ferry, and you can measure the actual flow there. And then they add back in all the upstream diversions and changes in storage. So you're trying to get to a number that represents how much water is available in this river for human use. So this is a graph that shows flow from 1906, which was when we started having records, up to 2025, this past year. And you can see, I mean, this is a busy chart, but you can see that there's a lot of volatility in this river, a lot of variation in the flow. We have low flow years like 1977 and 2002 that are like a quarter of what we get during high flow years like 1983. So we've got a very volatile water supply, but we can also see certain trends. And one of the ways that you can look at this is to just average the flow over periods of time. So this is the average for the 20th century. And it's 15.2 million acre-feet. So again, you know, just thinking back to that previous slide where there's legal allocation of 19 million, don't have that much in the river. And then if you look at the 21st century, it's gone down, mainly because of a warming climate. So now we're at 12.3 million acre-feet for the average for these 26 years. That's a decrease of 9% from the previous century. And even more relevant, there are periods of time within the 21st century where we had sustained lower flows. Like the 5-year period from 2000 to 2004 averaged at 9.5 million acre-feet. And the most recent period of 6 years, starting in 2020, was only 10.8 million acre-feet. So again, thinking back to those legal allocations, we've got a whole lot less water in the river than has been legally allocated. And this isn't just another way to look at it. This is a inflow-outflow chart. It's sort of like a income statement or a bank statement for your checking account. So we have inflows of natural flow, and this is natural flow from the most recent 6 years, so 2020 to 2025, 11.6 million acre feet. Then we have outflows, upper basin use, lower basin evaporation, Mexico, all that you can see adds up to almost 13 million to 15 million acre feet, which clearly leaves us with a deficit balance of somewhere between, let's say, 1.5 and 3.5 million acre feet. And these are not theoretical numbers. Last year, our deficit was about 3.5 million acre feet. Little more than this range because our natural flow was less than that average. So just like your bank account, if your expenses exceed your income, you can do that if you've got savings. And our savings in this case are the waters stored in our big reservoirs like Mead and Lake Powell. And because we have been exceeding our income, basically our demand has been exceeding our supply on a regular basis, we've been depleting our savings account. So this is a graph that shows the contents of Lake Powell and Lake Mead combined over the 21st century. And it's obvious that our savings account is going down. And it went down very precipitously from 2000 to 2005. That was one of those low flow periods that I showed on the natural flow slide. And then we sort of bumped along for a while. We had a good year in 2011. We go way down after that. We bump along pretty even for a while. And then recently, because of our hydrology and shrinking flows, we've been going down a lot. We had a good year in 2023, but we're continuing to slide again. And we're so close to the bottom of the accessible storage in these reservoirs that it's really concerning. So this is just to kind of ground us in what different sectors are using the water in the basin. And this pie chart on the left shows total use that includes agriculture, evaporation from the reservoirs. This is sort of natural use, the riparian and wetland vegetation, how much water they use in the system, and then municipal, commercial, and industrial use. And over on the right, the pie chart shows just the direct human uses. So you can think of it as about 3/4 of the water is used for agriculture and about 1/4 is used for these other purposes. Okay, so current events. This is what we're focused on right now. All of the operating rules that we've been operating under since 2007, so basically for the last about 20 years, are going to expire at the end of this year. And for the past 2.5 to almost 3 years, the 7 basin states have been trying to reach an agreement that they could all support about how to operate the river system in the future. But they haven't been able to come to a consensus. The deadline, the next and final deadline for that consensus agreement is only about 2 weeks away, February 14th. In the meantime, Reclamation on January 9th published a draft environmental impact statement for whatever the operational regime is going to be after this year when the existing regime expires. And in that document, they analyzed different alternatives for operating the system and looked at the environmental impacts. So that EIS was published on January 9th. Comments are due on March 2nd. There's a 45-day comment period. So it looks at 5 alternatives, and one of those is the no action alternative, which is a requirement of any environmental impact statement. And in this case, it's sort of interesting because no action doesn't mean we continue to operate the same way as we have been for the past 20 years, because all of that agreement and previous environmental impact analysis, all of that expires. So no action takes us back to an even earlier operating system that really came together in 1970 and is in no way sufficient to deal with current conditions on the river. So that's no action. That's the first alternative, and everything else is compared against that. The first action alternative is called basic coordination, and that is what Reclamation and the Department of the Interior think they can do with existing authority. So what they could do without having any state agreement and without going to Congress for additional authority. That's basic coordination. And then you can see the names of the next alternatives that are examined. And enhanced coordination is one alternative that is based on input from several of the Colorado River Basin tribes. And that has additional reductions in water usage in it, and more attention to environmental benefits. Maximum operating flexibility is the most robust. It comes from a proposal that was put forward by several conservation groups, environmental NGOs. And then supply-driven alternative is based on proposals from the upper and lower basin states. And what Reclamation is trying to do here is to have in this EIS and the alternatives that are being examined a broad enough spectrum so that if the states can come to an agreement, like really quickly, Reclamation will have examined in its EIS whatever the states come up with, because it'll fit within that broad spectrum. Whether that works legally under the National Environmental Policy Act and all the interpretations of that act, I'm not sure, but that is the theory. Okay. Let me just say that with respect to that basic coordination strategy or alternative, again, it's what the feds think they can do if the states don't agree, which is looking increasingly likely. But the problem is that their existing authority doesn't give them enough room to stabilize the system. They don't have the ability to do enough to balance supply with demand. And so the river and the reservoirs could continue to decline if that's all we have. So I think it's fair to say that if you look across this spectrum of alternatives that are analyzed in the draft EIS, some of them are way more robust than others, but they pose really significant trade-offs between very big cuts to supplies in the lower basin, really big cuts to supplies. But if that doesn't happen, insufficient reaction to continued low flows in the system. So if you see what I mean, if we continue to have low flows, which the climate scientists are telling us is likely, you have to really reduce water use, and there have to be reductions, cuts to the supplies that we're all used to using in the lower basin. And if you don't do that, then you don't stabilize the system. So there's a trade-off that has to be analyzed and managed between really significant impacts on water users and insufficient reaction to the current hydrological reality. Another notable component of the draft EIS is that it does not contain any mandatory cuts to upper basin usage. That's a source of huge disagreement between the basins, as you might imagine. And there are no evaporation charges, interestingly, on water that's stored, water that's conserved and then stored in either Lake Mead or Lake Powell, which does evaporate, but none of these alternatives propose to charge against those supplies for the actual evaporation that's occurring. So some tribal issues. This range of alternatives include both pro rata reductions to water use in the lower basin. That's one alternative, pro rata reductions. And another way of doing it is prior appropriation reductions, which means that the most junior priorities would take cuts first. And then only if those are insufficient would you progress to more senior priority water rights. And that has implications both ways for tribes. If you cut or reduce water use through prior appropriation, junior priorities get cut first. And the most junior priority in the lower basin is the Central Arizona Project. There are a lot of tribes who have CAP water rights as part of their settlements or, as part of their settlements. And those are junior priorities. So they could be cut first, but pro rata reduction impacts senior tribal rights in the lower basin. And so there's tension there. And it's understandable that tribes are going to be divided on exactly that issue. I wanted to call attention to one appendix in the draft EIS, Appendix H, that describes the potential for storage of the unused component of tribal water rights. Heather referred to this. Some tribes have decreed or settled rights, but they haven't been able to use them all. That has been a big issue, particularly in the upper basin. How will tribes be compensated for that unused component of their rights that other people are now enjoying the use of? This appendix describes the possibility of storing that unused tribal rights component in a conservation pool so that it would not be available to other water users. There's complicated issues around that, but there's a lot of discussion about the potential in this appendix. And then we wanted to call attention to some particular actions that tribes have taken with respect to this, whatever the new set of operating guidelines are going to look like. In 2022, 6 of the Upper Basin tribes and 10 conservation groups published a shared vision, and there's a picture of it here on the right. It was called a Resolution for Sustainability, and it's worth taking a look at. It talks about a sustainable and resilient river, with attention being paid to the cultural and spiritual values inherent in the Colorado River system and the relationship between tribes and the river. And then just recently in October of last year, the Colorado River Indian tribes recognized the Colorado River as a living being. And that resolution was intended to give legal personhood to the river so that the effects on the river can be considered in any actions that the tribe takes, just like impacts on a person. And then I'm going to wrap up with just a little discussion of the possibility of litigation over the Colorado River Compact and how the river's operated, because we're hearing a lot more about that in recent months. So remember that the compact requires 75 million acre feet over 10 years and half of the obligation to Mexico. That amount of water has to pass Lee Ferry. If you add all those up, you get to 82.5 million acre feet. And that we all often refer to that number, 82.5 million. It's probably a little less than that right now because our deliveries to Mexico have been reduced in recent years. But we talk about that number as the tripwire. And that tripwire is going to be crossed pretty soon, this year or next year. And that could trigger litigation. And let me explain what this chart is showing you. So this blue line shows the actual amount of water over the past 10 years that have passed Lee Ferry. And for the most part, that's releases from Lake Powell. So we started out in 2023 at about 86 million acre feet over the 10 previous years, went down a little bit in 2024. And then because releases from Lake Powell have been reduced, this 10-year consecutive number is going down. And it will continue to go down. This is where we are going to be at the end of September of this year, 2026. And because we think we know what the releases out of Lake Powell are going to be for next year, because things have been so dry and the reservoirs are so low, we are projecting this orange line, which you can see crosses the tripwire by the end of this year. What that means is the upper basin could be out of compliance with the compact, and that would provide the opportunity for the lower basin states to sue, maybe sue the upper basin states directly, maybe sue the Department of the Interior for not operating the river in a way that complies with the compact. Don't know. But that's a big concern. And that's what people are talking about for the most part when they talk about litigation over the compact or over the Colorado River. The upper basin states don't want to see that happen. And part of the discussions that have been going on include a waiver of litigation. So the lower basin states would agree not to litigate over this 10-year compact obligation. In order to make that happen, though, the lower basin states have to feel that they are getting a sufficient benefit to induce them to waive their compact rights, at least for a period of time. And that is the subject of a lot of discussion right now. Okay, so what can we do? Well, there are informational webinars that will be very informative, I think, about this DEIS. There's one tomorrow at 3 p.m. There's another one on February 10th. And we can provide information about those webinars. There's a specific tribal information exchange that has been set up for the purpose of this post-2026 discussion, where Reclamation shares information just with tribal representatives. There's one of those on February 3rd. You can contact your state's principal negotiator and tell him or her what you think about the DEIS and how it will impact your own tribe's water rights. Comments on the DEIS are due on March 2nd. Maybe there's a tribal council resolution or a statement that your tribe would like to make with respect to the DEIS and how it impacts your specific water rights. And I would also just urge you to remember that access to clean drinking water is an issue that can be addressed here. It's not discussed, but reminding everyone, and particularly the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of the Interior, that that's an issue that tribes are concerned about, I think is always a good thing. So here are QR codes for the draft EIS itself. You've probably heard it's 1,600 pages. The executive summary is 66 pages, so it's really long. So that's the QR code on the left. On the right is Reclamation's information about the public review, these webinars, all that kind of stuff. If you're not into QR codes, you can just Google Reclamation, Colorado River, DEIS, and it will get you there right away. So that's it. And I'm hoping we'll have a good discussion and lots of time for questions.
Thank you, Anne. And I apologize, everyone. I did schedule this until 1:15, so we do have about 18 minutes until then. So I know some of you might need to drop off since it's going to be soon 1 o'clock or at the hour. I know we're not all in Mountain Time, but I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions for either Anne or Heather. And I'll give everybody a minute. If not, I have my own questions. We can start. All right, Crystal, go ahead.
I have two questions, one for Heather and then one for Anne. So the first question for Heather is regarding the Tribal Clean Water bill that is currently being considered in Congress. Have hearings already occurred for the bill? And then also curious for Anne, given your current capacity, your last, your previous capacity as the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, as you describe, the draft EIS for post 2026 is currently a plate of options, and we know that the seven basin states are convening and trying to come up with a consensus. Curious about like public comment. And I mean, given that there's an opportunity for public comment that is due by March 2nd, but what what can be really described? Because usually we're used to where an alternative is selected and you respond to that. But I'm just kind of curious of what's useful in this situation where the plate of options is presented, but there's a potential option that's not clearly defined that could be described as the future operating guidelines. I mean, it's just an uncertain time and maybe an unprecedented time to have what we're dealing with at this moment. So just curious about that as far as any suggestions you might have regarding how to formulate a public comment letter given the unique situation we are in. Thank
Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, so I think what's been fascinating is, this is not the first time that this bill has been introduced, and it gets further and further along each time. And so it's kind of, I think a lot of laws we find that they have to go through a process and it's kind of a long-term game. And so this time around, we got Legislative Council review. That was new, right? There has not been a hearing set up before the committees yet, like the Senate Committee of Indian Affairs, but we have draft comment letters that we prepared and are looking at in the next few weeks here of using that as an opportunity to kind of re-ping in with staff. Something going in our favor is that water access tends to be a bipartisan issue. And so we're hopeful, again, with all the kind of political tension notwithstanding that's happening and divides, that this is something everybody can get behind. We want kids to have water. I'll put in as well, Hopkins did some great work with their Center for Indigenous Health out with Navajo, documenting like their water needs, and they really helped provide additional information. And I think most people, when they hear about the lack of water access, they agree every American should get water. This is the United States. We should do that. And so we're kind of hoping it'll continue to get through and that it's the type of bill that can be passed, notwithstanding some other kind of political divides we have right now.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And to answer your second question, Crystal, I have some of the same concerns that you're expressing. Um, so this is a really important environmental impact statement and NEPA process. It's hugely impactful on the Colorado River Basin. And I find it concerning that the, the stated process is we're publishing this draft EIS. It's got 5 alternatives. But if the states come up with an alternative, we're going to plunk that in between the draft and the final without giving people the opportunity to do public comment on that specific alternative. It's just going to be probably the preferred alternative in a final EIS. Maybe that's, I'm not a NEPA lawyer, so I don't know if that's okay under NEPA, but it's concerning. So I agree with, I think, the concern that you were alluding to. In terms of what we can do to comment um, meaningfully on this draft, I think, as always, pointing out environmental impacts that have not been pointed to or considered or described in the EIS, specific impacts on the Navajo Nation or on a water right that you're concerned about or an environmental resource that you're concerned about. That's always useful. Pointing out if there's a particular resource that impacts were analyzed on, if you think they're insufficient. So, I mean, that's what you do in commenting on any draft. But if you think it's a problem, I think it's fair to also point out that the procedure that's being followed here of not exactly knowing what the final outcome is going to be if the states are able to come to an agreement, that's worth commenting on as well.
Thank you, Anne. Does anybody else have any questions?
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Talia.
Hi.
You
Hi.
disappeared.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Heather. And I don't know, maybe Crystal could chime in too, but I was curious about like, because I know there's the Navajo Nation water settlement that is being discussed in Congress or introduced. And I'm curious, what alternatives impact what's happening there in trying to get that settlement passed?
Well, yeah, I'd be very interested in Crystal's reaction to that question, Talia, but I think they're proceeding independently. We don't know if congressional action will be necessary for this particular EIS. So just in terms of congressional attention, I don't know if there will be, sort of a distraction because of a need to legislate on the Colorado River operating guidelines and taking attention away from the Navajo Hopi San Juan Paiute settlement. I do think there is a potential tension in the allocation of money required. The Northeastern Arizona settlement requires a bunch of money from Congress to be at least authorized initially. It is also possible that a Colorado River deal that the states come to would require a significant authorization of money, basically to pay people not to use water. So that, just the tension in how much money do we want to allocate for issues in the Colorado River, that could raise a problem, I think.
Just real briefly, just wanted to highlight what Anne was describing. The Navajo Nation does believe that these things could concurrently occur because, sometimes we're in a unique situation to where previous water rights settlements that the Navajo Nation has engaged in, the operating guidelines for the Colorado River were known, but in this case, they're unknown. And so, we're of the opinion that they can concurrently occur on, the railroad tracks as two trains going down. And then speaking to the question, just to be able to provide an update, we still are working on seven basin state consensus as well as working for a hearing. And, a congressional hearing, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs will really provide that opportunity to address any concerns that the states have in the Colorado River Basin associated with the water rights settlement. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah, and I think that's another area again where it's like you shouldn't underestimate your getting more allies and people to be aware of issues so that collectively we can be contacting our representatives. Because one of those holdouts, right, of my understanding of why all the seven basins weren't in alignment or giving their support letter was the use of upper basin water and lower basin that was being proposed. And anyway, so, again, call your negotiators, get your letter, get everyone, right? Because this is something like that absolutely should be passed. And when you look at adjudicated, I think there's something like 40 or so tribal water rights have gone through adjudication, and the average was like 22 years to go through the process. And a lot of them ended up, even though they start out in court, end up in settlement. And so it's definitely a long-term game, but I think we've been going long enough on the kind of the water issues and rights that are at issue in that legislation. So
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Crystal. Do we have any other questions?
Terry, I saw that you asked a question about evaporation. And, warming temperatures do increase evaporation, and they increase evapotranspiration from natural vegetation as well as irrigated crops. And so that increases the demand for water. What's interesting, though, about the Colorado River system is because the reservoirs are shrinking, they have less surface area. And so evaporation from the surface of the reservoirs has been decreasing. That's not necessarily a great thing because we'd like to have more water in the reservoirs, but there are some offsets there.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to think about for sure. Does anybody else have any questions? I did have one more question if there's nobody else. This looks really... I wanted to go back. I wanted to go back between the alternatives that have the pro rata and the prior appropriation, because I think that's really key to tribal sovereignty and to be able to exercise self-determination. How do you all see like the proposed alternatives? Which ones ensure tribal nations are treated as sovereign governments with the senior legal rights? I know that's kind of an easy, it's probably the ones that have the prior appropriations in there, but how are tribes engaging in that fight to maintain their tribal sovereignty? And also, how can those of us who are advocates for tribal sovereignty, how can we engage in that process to make sure that we're advocating effectively?
Well, let me take a crack at that, and then I'd be interested in Heather's viewpoint, but also others of you in the room. This is a classic example of there is no one best alternative for tribes. These alternatives affect different tribes differently. And like I was saying with the pro rata versus prior appropriation procedure for cuts, that affects different tribes differently, and different ones would benefit. There's also the tension between upper basin and lower basin tribes. The lower basin writ large believes that the upper basin, including its tribes, should participate in the necessary reductions to balance supply with demand. The upper basin states say that because they already take shortages when there's not enough water, because we don't, the upper basin doesn't have big reservoirs above their water users like the lower basin states do. Um, because of that, the upper basin shouldn't have to reduce further. That is a fundamental disagreement between the upper and lower basins, and that affects the tribes in those two basins. So to get to your question, I think what IWLN and its members can do is help facilitate the articulation of how these alternatives affect their particular tribe and why or why not that part of the regime should be adopted or not. Um, I really don't think there's a one size fits all here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say, part of I think the challenge about when you're looking at Colorado River discussions and governance is how closed it is. There's opportunity for comment because of the NEPA process, because NEPA, the law itself and statute mandates and requires public comment. And a lot of these meetings between when tribes are meeting with states or the states among themselves and feds, like you can't go to those. You can't listen in, or there's not an easy mechanism, I think, for the broader public to engage, except maybe if we start changing that, writing letters to the representative, writing letters to your governor, right? To show, like, as a citizen of Colorado or Utah or wherever you are, these are the values that are important to us, and that should be in there beyond whatever traditionally has been considered. I think the way water law is governed and operates is a very old, kind of archaic way of doing it, but there's very strong interests that make it hard to change it drastically or quickly. The other thing, what was it? There's something else. Oh, it's just for me, I want tribes to be able to have the same decisions and ability as other state actors or other water users. And a big restriction we didn't talk about is that there's an interpretation on the Intercourse Act that because water and land resources are held in trust, right? Our tribes don't have all the rights of property rights that other people traditionally do. It requires federal approval if you're going to lease or kind of do other things. And so we've had some legislation passed, like with CRIT, that allows them to lease their water rights, but that's not a given for all tribes. And so that's why we have this challenge where tribal water rights, so one, every tribe should be able to fully utilize their water right if they want to, and in whatever way they want to. If that means it's contributing to conservation in the system for the health of the river, right? They should be able to do that with their right. Or building out the infrastructure so every home has potable water, those type of things. Our tribes are not fully able to do that right now. And like I mentioned, part of that is historic federal investment outside of Indian country and capacity limitations, yada, yada. But then the other is also like they want to lease, they want to store, market, right? Like they should have all of those same tools or opportunities available to them that they can make a decision on their own. There's been some little written, I think maybe one or pushes to introduce legislation that would broadly allow tribes to do that. But again, just think of the interests we're pushing up against, because if any tribe that is utilizing a drop more water, they're pulling it necessarily from someone else right now who's already using it.
Well, thank you, Heather. I appreciate it. All right, well, we're at 1:16, so I'm going to go ahead and end our webinar today. I want to thank Heather and Anne for helping to really make this information a lot more accessible. I think that's a huge challenge, and it actually gives folks an advantage when regular folks don't know really what's going on. And so I really appreciate you making this information more accessible to everyone. And I will be following up everyone with some links, some contact information. So be on the lookout for an email from me. And thank you so much. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.